Hello everyone, I'm Ashley Clayson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a first year candidate in the MTPC program, and today I'm going to talk about rhetoric and writing in engineering education. Two big things have happened in engineering education in the past 15 years that have caused engineering educators and administrators to take another look at communication in their curricula. First, in 1996, ABET, the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, changed its accreditation guidelines in an attempt to get engineering programs to create global, professional engineers with better communication and critical thinking skills. Criterion 3 cites the learning objectives of good engineering programs, and 3G specifically calls for an ability to communicate effectively. Secondly, in 2004, the National Academy of Engineering published The Engineer of 2020, Visions of Engineering in the New Century. They spend an entire section on communication, which concludes with, quote, "The increasing imperative for accountability will necessitate an ability to communicate convincingly and shape the opinions and attitudes of other engineers and the public." What the Academy wants are engineers skilled in rhetoric, even if they aren't calling it that. Because of these initiatives, some schools are making changes to their curriculum, such as at MIT, where students must meet a communication requirement consisting of 4 communication-intensive courses, 2 of which must be in the major, or at NC State, where students in all majors must fulfill a communication in the major requirement in the sophomore or junior year. However, most programs are still focusing primarily on the other criteria required by ABET, and researchers in engineering education are constantly trying to discover the best ways to prepare engineers for these professional competencies. Here at Auburn University, I work in the Laboratory for Innovative Technology and Engineering Education, or the LIGHT Lab, which focuses on the development and testing of one particular pedagogical tool, case studies. LIGHT defines a case study as an instructional tool that brings real-world problems into classrooms for students to participate in, learn from, and analyze. A typical case study presents an open-ended problem faced by a company in real life. The case provides students with information about all factors involved and asks them to argue for a particular solution to the problem. There are often multiple viable solutions to a case, but they do typically have a, quote, best solution. In this way, students get away from the, quote, plug and chug method of rote learning and are able to practice critical thinking skills that are essential for the kinds of problems practicing engineers face. When LIGHT began in 1996, the cases were developed by instructors, but eventually the directors created a program that enabled the students to develop case studies as well, called the IRIS program. In this program, students travel to India for a summer to work with an industrial partner to document and solve an engineering problem. At the end of the summer, they turn their experience into a multimedia case study available for other students to use in the classrooms. In this way, these students not only get the chance to develop professional skills and global awareness, but then also bring back their experiences to their peers, who then also benefit through the case studies. For example, one recent Irish student, Michael from Civil Engineering, went to India in the summer of 2009 to work with Larsen & Toubro, a construction firm, and the Indian Institute of Technology Madras, which is situated on a national park. IIT needed to provide more residential housing while restricting land use to 24% in accordance with the national park guidelines. When I first saw Michael's draft of the case study, I was immediately taken with the sheer volume of writing he had done to construct the case, and it was only a first draft. I talked with Michael about his process of writing the case, and I found that he was making conscious decisions about what to include, making rhetorical choices, but he didn't have a vocabulary to help him talk about those choices. During the rest of our time, I'll show you specific examples of his choices and argue that case studies could be a valuable tool in teaching engineering students about science, rhetoric, and communication. First, Michael consciously presents the case as the product of an author. This case study has been designed in such a way that reading sections in order will provide the best understanding of the topics. You may be tempted to skip around, but we ask you to do so only after having gone through the case in its entirety at least once. First, he acknowledges the case's existence as a product having been produced by someone, has been designed. Then he uses first and second person pronouns to more directly create that someone for the reader. The use of first-person pronouns is mostly limited to this first page of the introduction, where this author positioning is most prominent. But the use of second-person pronouns continues heavily throughout the rest of the introduction and appears occasionally later on. Second person is typically used in interrogative or imperative statements, and these statements are designed to perform a number of functions throughout the case. First, for example, many of the questions, especially in the overview of the case, are used to generate student interest in the topic. such as the questions we find in the background section. What sort of climate changes would you expect between Chennai and a town in the United States such as Auburn, Alabama? These statements are designed to get students to invest themselves in the world of the case study. This way, the students are more likely to, quote, take responsibility for their own learning, one of the main goals of case study methodology. If the students care about the background of the case, they're more likely to invest themselves in successfully solving the problem. Other questions are designed to get students to think about the problem presented in the case and practice analytical thought, such as in the section titled Overview, Defining Comfort. The case asks, how would the two distributions compare, and what can this be attributed to? Other questions, such as those in the very last section, Designing the Next Generation of Hostels, were designed to help students consider the information present, synthesize it, and make decisions based upon it. All critical thinking skills, which are the goals of case studies. The use of imperative sentences, too, creates a unique author positioning, that of teacher or author to student or audience. Though the members of the authoring group were all students, some of whom had no background in design, they positioned themselves as experts in this case study. Using the imperative voice gives them a position of authority, especially in the beginning, when they are instructing their audience to take stock of the context of the problem and situate themselves therein. They also, however, use the imperative voice later in the case study to draw the audience's attention to important details in the case that will help them come to the correct conclusions. These sentences all begin with note and are designed to implicitly argue for a specific solution to the case. While in these sections, the authors use questions and imperative verbs to bring the students closer to the case study and get them involved. In other sections, the authors use passive voice to distance themselves from the information and the audience. Passive voice has traditionally been used in scientific rhetoric to distance the author from the data, basically saying that the further the author is from the data, the more objective and therefore truthful the data is. The authors of this case study use passive voice most often in their discussion of data collection, and presentation. They occasionally slip and use phrases that bring the author back into the foreground, such as our sample period and as we saw, but most often discussions of data collection and presentation are exemplified by the following paragraph. To assess the thermal comfort of various IIT Madras hostels, 2 types of data were collected. The first data set is comprised of sampled data. Roughly 20 rooms were selected. In each hostel, measurements were taken at 3 times, noon, afterward, and evening. The second data set includes the same measurements, but is continuous over a 24-hour period. For the second data set, a smaller number of rooms were selected. Aside from the rhetoric and the actual language of the case study, functional dormitory design presents several opportunities for visual rhetoric. In the introduction, images are most often used to, again, generate interest in the problem. The first page especially is designed to bring the students into the world of IIT Madras. In the rest of the case study, pictures are often used as a means to provide context for specific information. On many pages, photographs accompany the illustrations used to explain concepts. The authors use both images for a reason. The figures succinctly and clearly illustrate crucial points, while the pictures more clearly situate the concepts within the context. The most interesting use of visual rhetoric is the students' use of graphs, mainly because, as I was talking to Michael in the midst of one of his revisions, he was struggling with the graphs you see here. When I asked why he was dissatisfied with these graphs, he said, "They don't say anything." He went on to explain that he was using the graphs to get people to come to certain conclusions, and that these particular graphs showed no trends. In essence, they made no arguments. Marsochi was using scientific rhetoric in the construction of his graphs. Though he never mentioned the idea of rhetoric himself, he did know his group's choices had a purpose. So, the development of a case study provides several opportunities to teach students about scientific rhetoric, about the subtleties of communication, about discreetly leading audiences to an answer without seeming to. But the actual process itself is also an excellent example to teach students about the creation of knowledge through writing, and about how knowledge changes as you draft and revise to create a product. Unfortunately, the current methods at Light for teaching students case study development don't quite delve into these things. The current instruction on case study development consists of transferring old case study materials into a new online format. The students took Word documents or CD-ROM versions of old case studies that contain both text and images, and basically just used Light's XML software to create interactive versions of those old case studies. Basically a copy-paste method of learning the case format. But they didn't get into the subtleties of how to lead students to a solution, how to present data graphically, how to present yourself as a case author, how to get students to invest themselves in a case. The students mostly dealt with the organization of materials, which of course is in itself a rhetorical consideration, but which was already mostly laid out for them. They were able to see the main parts of a case study, an overview, background, problem statement, details, and alternatives, but even those vary from case to case and weren't necessarily discussed in terms of their function. This section should get students to do this, etc., etc. So in my paper, I propose that this case study instruction should be modified to include three main elements: conventions of case studies, scientific rhetoric, and visual rhetoric. First, the students should learn what a case study is and what their conventions are. By providing students an explanation of each of the parts, what the typical features of those parts are, how they work together, and how they're supposed to function, students will be able to more easily design their cases to achieve their goals. They will begin to see how language and its presentation shapes the decisions of others. Secondly, case developers should be taught about science and visual rhetoric. In my discussion with Michael about his case study, I could tell that, even as a senior engineering student, he had never been taught about the use of science rhetoric, at least not as described as such. He knew he manipulated data in order to reach a certain goal, as is evident through his struggles with the graphs, but he didn't have the vocabulary to talk about his rhetorical choices as such. It is important to teach students not only the techniques that are used, frequent use of figures, tables, graphs, passive voice, discussion methodology, and frequent use of lists, to name a few, but how to talk about them. Only through this kind of meta-discourse can students really understand why such techniques are used. Once a student can understand the reasoning for using different rhetorical moves, making them becomes much easier. Had Marsoji been instructed in the tools and vocabulary of scientific rhetoric, he not only would have been able to explain his goals and his techniques, he would of course been able to execute them more gracefully to the benefit of both himself and the future audience of his case study. Unfortunately, the Irish project was only funded for 3 years, 2009 being the last year. We've applied for funding again, but we won't know for some time whether we'll get the grant again. It would be interesting to see how this kind of instruction would change the case studies. It's obviously a very expensive and complex project, so the likelihood of this kind of program being conducted in universities across the nation is pretty slim, but I still think this kind of case study development could take place maybe on a smaller scale, with students and classes going out to local engineering firms to document problems in a case study. This way, they learn about what practicing engineers do, they make those professional connections, they develop those professional skills, but they also get the chance to learn through writing and learn about writing and communication.